don't leave me. Please, Lordy, don't leave me alone.
Life as a freed slave was hard. The official end of slavery in the December of 1865 was not as successful as many had hoped. Suddenly, 4 million African Americans found themselves with almost no support. The plan to give every African American farming community 40 acres and a mule died with Lincoln. Many southern states passed laws preventing former slaves from migrating elsewhere. With nowhere to go, many of them became sharecroppers or tenant farmers, a situation only slightly above slavery. However, some freed slaves avoided this tragedy and together created triumphant farming communities that lasted generations. Here are some stories from these communities in the coastal PD region in South Carolina.
Please, Lordy, don't leave me. Please, Lordy, don't leave me alone.
Friendfield Plantation, Hobcob Barony, 1840. The master at Friendfield Plantation has built a dozen small slave cabins to support the positive good philosophy of slavery. Flash forward to 1865. The 13th Amendment has been ratified. The master frees his slaves, sells his plantation, and moves away. The slaves, though freed, have nowhere to go. However, the new owner of Hobcob Barony has struck a deal.
In the post-Civil War era, freed slaves continued living at Hobcob Barony and working for a new owner, and they were planting rice, continuing in very much the same careers and same living conditions. Think of it as employee housing after the American Civil War.
Those who remained on the plantation could work on the farm for a wage. Many stayed at Friendfield because it provided housing, food, family, and financial stability. In the 20th century, new plantation owner Bernard Baruch continued paying the African Americans. Village residents occupied former slave cabins. Some still stand today. Over time, a doctor's clinic, a church, and new homes were built from recycled remains of other old buildings.
That not only were there dances, but church was always the center of life, whether it was a religious service or whether, as we've discussed, the church building served as a community center. To plant their own vegetable gardens, they planted their own rice and sometimes their own corn. They also raised hogs, they raised chickens, and had milk cows in addition.
Friendfield Village remained inhabited for almost 100 years. However, increased employment opportunities and the desire to own land slowly decreased the population at Friendfield. By 1952, the village was completely abandoned. Friendfield Village might be seen as a triumphant freed slave community to many. However, the African Americans there did not own the land they worked.
They were working on the land that they had never owned, of course, as slaves, land they did not inherit, land they were not given following the war, but instead remained on the plantation as employees, not sharecroppers, but employees.
One might discredit Friendfield as a freed slave village because of this. However, even if they weren't truly free, the African Americans on Friendfield still managed to create a triumphant, thriving community.
God spoke to Noah, brother Noah, he stopped. Don't listen here, Noah, won't you build me an ark?
Longwood Plantation, Georgetown County, 1864. New Year's Eve. The master of Longwood Plantation has gathered his slaves. Fearing that General Sherman will burn his land, the master has decided to free the slaves but gives them no support. Later, these slaves purchased a strip of swampland along the Waccamaw River. They name it Freewood's Farm, signifying no slave had ever worked there.
One of the big challenges farmers in this community had was learning how to farm in or on wetlands. And they were able to acquire land in this area essentially because the plantation owners didn't consider this area suitable for farming.
Unlike Friendfield Village, Freewood's Farm inhabitants owned their land, but conditions for growing rice were not optimal, so these farmers chose cotton, tobacco, sugarcane, and other cash crops to provide their livelihood. Initially, Freewood's was split between African American and white farms. By the 1920s, Freewood's was entirely African American owned, thus making one large farming community.
Those farmers built churches. Most of the churches we have in the rural areas and small towns were built by those farmers. They built schools. These Rosenwald schools were 6 and 7 rooms. And they became the primary schools for black kids in rural areas.
Due to increased employment opportunities for African Americans and the obsolescence of non-mechanized farming, Freewood's farm was all but lost by the 1960s when the next generation sold their land and moved away. Today, Freewood's farm has a new purpose: to educate about African American farming communities. Mr. Smalls reopened the farm as a living museum in the early 2000s. Consisting of 40 acres and 2 mules, a symbol of the promise once made to the freed slaves, it demonstrates how African Americans on Freewood's farm managed to unite and create a triumphant, thriving community.
60 feet wide and 6 feet high. I wanted to hold that reigning tide.
Sandy Island, Georgetown County, 1880. Intending to create a haven against the discriminatory attitudes of the South, former slave Philip Washington uses rice to purchase a tract of land now known as Sandy Island. He builds a rice farming community that can worship together and educate future generations in peace.
They had like collards, peanut, sweet potato, white potato, sweet peas, and corn and watermelon.
The farmers on Sandy Island were able to take advantage of the ebbing tide to profitably grow rice and stay isolated for decades. This isolation prolonged the existence of the Gullah culture on the island, a series of customs involving a blend of African American traditions and language. However, the 20th century brought about many changes to the island, including education and job opportunities on the mainland, causing the abandonment of rice farming.
It was 1965 when electricity came, and water came in the early, I think 2000, and telephone came in 1978, I think, or something like that.
Today, Sandy Island has less than 100 inhabitants and is protected from development as a nature preserve. Children going to school and adults commuting to work travel by boat to the mainland. The slowly aging descendants of the original residents look to their small number of children in hopes of preserving their community.
At the time, the South didn't have much for our race to do. So most people was going up north. And then when they get up north, everything is so comfortable. I don't have to get on the boat no more. No cold mornings. I can just get in my car and go, so they just move away.
Although the population has declined, Sandy Island is the most successful example for how agriculture allowed these African American farming communities to thrive after the emancipation.
Please, Lord, don't leave. Please, Lord, don't leave me. No.
The freed slave communities have had many short and long-term effects on the coastal PD region. Initially, these communities existed throughout the South and helped power the American agricultural industry in the 19th century.
The United States has the leading agricultural industry in the world, and those black farmers played a major role in developing that agricultural economy.
Most freed slave communities like Friendfield and Freewoods disappeared by the 1960s. However, their long-term effects as artifacts teach future generations about the contributions each made to the shaping of American culture. However, the most important impact made by these communities, especially Sandy Island, is the preservation of the Gullah culture.
That perhaps this Gullah culture, the language, the cooking, the way of life, continued because people continued living as community.
Please, Lord, don't leave me. Guide me on my way.
From immense tragedy, triumph can emerge. The long history of freed slave communities in the coastal PD region is a testament to how former slaves managed to make the best out of a difficult situation post-emancipation. Through agriculture and a resilient spirit, these people were able to build thriving communities and preserve their culture.
But I determined to live there until I die. I don't want to go anyplace else.